Okay, everyone, I think that this is on. I'm going to ask people to tell us if we can hear you or you can hear us. Chris, do you want to say something to make sure we test that as well?
Yeah, this is a test. The BBC test is usually what I have for breakfast. So I had porridge today, as usual, and
Great.
a cup of tea.
I had
Yeah.
two boiled eggs
Ah,
and a
is
piece of
that your
toast.
usual?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my usual. Yeah, it's like what we have on digs and stuff, and I still have it here. And
Yeah.
everybody says good sound, so we're good to go on that. So,
Okay.
everybody, I want to welcome you all to Real Archaeology. This is the teaser of it, the first event. And I want to just make sure that you check out our website. We have a full weekend of activity for you. We have about 60 different content creators, YouTubers, podcasters, TikTokers, bloggers, Twitter threaders. I don't know who else we're missing. We have everybody. And so it runs all weekend, and I hope you check us out. We're at real-archaeology.com, and we can show you some of the events that are coming up later today after I finish talking with Chris. I think everything technically is working, and so this is Professor Chris Stringer. He is an amazing paleoanthropologist. He works at the Natural History Museum here in the UK, as well as at UCL and Royal Holloway, you said you're a visiting professor at? And so he has been publishing in this field for decades, and he's very prominently and well known for the out of Africa hypothesis, as well as dealing with a lot of Neanderthal remains. And I think we're going to focus on Neanderthal stuff. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Chris, about what you do and what your
No,
interests
that's
are?
fine. No, obviously we'll wander off in different directions, I'm sure. But yeah, let's
Perfect.
start with Neanderthals.
Well, actually, I want to start. I was just telling him this morning. Nope, wrong. Yeah, right thing. This morning I was teaching about human evolution here at Cardiff, and I inherited a couple lectures from Julia Best. And in the lecture was this timeline of human evolution. And this is what Chris emailed me last night as a jumping off point for us to discuss. So I've told all my students they have to tune into this because their assignment actually for this module is to create a timeline of human evolution, digging into
Ah,
the evidence on the Smithsonian Institute's website on different
yeah.
species that relate to human evolution to create this kind of timeline. So they'll be digging in this weekend and next week into this kind of information on human evolution in order to put together a timeline like this same one that we discussed. So, if you had to do this timeline again, what would your advice be for my students?
Well, obviously, the first thing is, are these all different species? So I've labelled some of these as species, but that's obviously a fundamental issue. Um, I've got here a thing at the bottom saying LCA, last common ancestor. So the time of the last common ancestor of us and Neanderthals and Denisovans is certainly under dispute and argument at the moment. And I would say it's probably older than I show on this timeline. So you can see there's little dotted lines converging around maybe 700,000 years. I
Mm-hmm.
think the last common ancestor is going to be much deeper in time. So your students should certainly look into that question. When did
Okay.
the last common ancestor live?
What is
And the
the
interbreeding too. There's
How
a
are
lot
we
of,
estimating that? Are we estimating that based on genetic clocks, or what does that
well,
come
yeah,
from?
so the dotted lines on there are kind of in line with the genetic estimates, which are maybe 500 to 700,000 years for our common ancestor with Neanderthals and Denisovans.
Mm-hmm.
But there's fossil data from China and also estimates based on dental evolution that would push it back closer to 1 million years.
Wow.
So that's certainly a point of discussion at the moment. And the interbreeding, of course, I've represented it very simply on this diagram. So we know in the last 100,000 years that we and Neanderthals and Denisovans were interbreeding. It must have been going on earlier as well between some of these other groups, but we really don't have the data because there isn't the DNA as we go back
Yeah.
further in time. So the interbreeding, yeah, there's all kinds of models you could put in for who's interbreeding with who.
And these hit upon exactly what I was trying to introduce to them, that different scholars, some are lumpers and some are splitters. And to get that
Yeah.
across to the audience, in a sense, we have these different fossil remains of different species. And, one of the questions is some of the variation just different populations within the same species, in which case that's lumping them together, or do they represent very different species, in which case that's splitting them apart? And so that's the kind of topics they need to really delve into. And I also
Yes.
mentioned that even though the assignment is to create kind of a family tree, we often don't always think of it or conceptualize it anymore as a family tree. It's I think John Hawkes and others have conceptualized it as a braided stream where we have these populations diverging, and then sometimes there's interbreeding where populations come back together. As you mentioned, Neanderthals and Denisovans are great examples of that. Do you want to talk about how some of this new data from genomics and aDNA is really complicating our picture and adding to it?
Yeah, so of course it's made a huge impact. So if you asked me 20 years ago, when you were really, I don't know how old you were 20 years ago, but anyway.
I was an undergrad, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I would have said that we and Neanderthals are different species based on morphology. And if there was any interbreeding, it would have been minimal. So there could have been some. I was aware that closely related mammal species and closely related bird species can do a bit of interbreeding, thinking of baboons in Africa, for example, wolves and jackals, even, lions and tigers, polar bears and brown bears. They can do a bit of interbreeding, but they're still distinct species, at least for most zoologists. So that was how I thought us and Neanderthals were. But I thought interbreeding maybe happened 40, 50,000 years ago. It wouldn't have been normal behavior. It would have been on a small scale. And given all the population changes afterwards, after the Neanderthals disappeared, that tiny amount would have vanished. So I thought that in practical terms, it was trivial. It was never going to be significant. But then in 2010, of course, the first high quality Neanderthal genome was reconstructed. And lo and behold, there was evidence that pretty well everyone outside of Africa had Neanderthal DNA, averaging around 2% in the people outside of Africa. And that was obviously a big surprise to most of us. But it showed that, yeah, maybe they're distinct species, but there is this interbreeding. Then, of course, in the same year, we began to learn about the Denisovans. Mm-hmm. So these were previously completely unknown people, but here were these fragmentary fossils from a cave in Siberia, excavated by Russian archaeologists, and these tiny fragments, teeth and a few little bits and pieces. You couldn't tell what species they were. The teeth were very big. And when the DNA was done, it was a new kind of human, not Neanderthal, sapiens, and they became known as Denisovans. So they were part of the picture. And then, of course, the revelation that people in the Far East and Southeast Asia have Denisovan DNA as well as Neanderthal DNA. So you really do start to get a more complicated picture. And initially, there were very few of these ancient genomes, and we didn't have really any from early Homo sapiens at that stage, but they started to come through. And what we could say is that in Europe, at least, all of the early Homo sapiens at, let's say, 45,000 or 40,000 have the Neanderthal DNA in them already. And in some cases, it's come in very recently, within the previous few generations. So there was active interbreeding.
Yeah, like just with grandparents or great-grandparents, we have those examples of active interbreeding. That's phenomenal. I mean, that's just
so
really...
the DNA showed us that as the quality of the data improved and the ability to extract tinier and tinier bits of DNA. And then, of course, even pushing back in time. So we now know that the Neanderthal lineage was already started by 400,000 years ago. I would have said that on fossils anyway, probably, but the DNA has been recovered from the Cima de los Huesos in Spain. So you've got this chamber deep in a cave, and they've recovered from a couple of bone fragments, what seems to be very early Neanderthal DNA from these 400,000-year-old fossils. So they're early on the Neanderthal lineage, which matches what we would have said from their morphology. And that shows you the power of recovery. So obviously that was a deep cave, so there were unusual conditions there that allowed a really ancient preservation of the material. So that was another surprise. And then, of course, we've extended even into sediment DNA. So now, remarkably, you don't even need bones to get the DNA from a cave site. So at Denisova Cave, we've got dozens of DNA sequences from little bits of bone and teeth, and some of them are Denisovans and some of them are Neanderthals. So we know Neanderthals were in Denisova Cave some of the time, and they were even interbreeding with each other, because you've got, incredibly, one tiny bone, which seems to be from a young girl. She had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. So that's the incredible kind of detail we can get from the story now. And from the sediment, They've even got evidence that Denisovans were there over 200,000 years ago, just from sediment DNA. So that's the kind of incredible story we can tell now from that DNA.
Yeah, and I mean, this kind of sequencing that lets us go back that far is really sort of changing the picture in a real clear way. So maybe I'm confused on this. I always thought that even people from Africa have small percentages of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA because of introgression of people moving back into Africa and then spreading it. Am I wrong there, or is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's true.
Okay.
So there is more of it in northern Africa, as you'd expect, with the Roman Empire moving around the Mediterranean, with the spread of Islam. You've had that movement of Neanderthal DNA. There's been trading around the Indian Ocean, of course, from Southeast Asia. So that would have brought a tiny bit of Denisovan DNA into populations in Eastern Africa and Madagascar. It's very small there, but compared with, further east, but there is a tiny bit of it. But when you get to populations like, say, the San, Khoisan people in southern Africa, they have negligible amounts of Neanderthal DNA. So where they haven't been affected by that gene flow, they have tiny amounts. So,
Okay. So in a
it
sense,
decreases as you move south.
we all have at least a little bit. It's just the amount we have varies from different human populations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. There may be some sub-Saharan Africa populations where you can pretty well say it's zero, but you'd have to talk to a geneticist to refine that. You'll be looking for tiny amounts.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the most amount of Denisovan DNA is not near Siberia, but down in Ireland, Southeast Asia. And that's a really interesting find that suggests the Denisovans were living down in Ireland, Southeast Asia, as well as in Siberia. Yeah. So people like people in Papua New Guinea, Australia, the Philippines, they can have some of them up to 4% Denisovan DNA, as well as having about 2% of Neanderthal DNA. So the Neanderthal DNA was acquired first, and then later on Denisovan DNA was added onto it. So it's a remarkable story.
Yeah, and in many ways it really goes to show how developing new methods in the field is really what drives us forward, probably more than new discoveries, if you see what I mean. I mean, you think about the only two people related to archaeology that have ever won Nobel Prizes. It's Willard Libby with radiocarbon, and it's Svante Pääbo with sequencing the Neanderthal genome. And it's these new methods that really are what changes our understanding and paradigms.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've made great technical improvements in the way we study fossils too, of course. We've got CT scanning and we've got, tomography. We've got fantastic microscopic studies that enable us to look at growth lines on teeth. And so there have been improvements on studying the fossils too. But of course, the big headlines are coming from the DNA. I used to say, well, there'd be a really big fossil discovery every 6 months or so. Well, earlier on in my career, really big discovery. Now there's a DNA thing every week. There's some new DNA story.
It's nuts how fast this goes. And I mean, I remember some article in Antiquity about 10, 15 years ago saying, archaeologists aren't finding many new things. And it was just sort of like, they published that right at the wrong time, because since then we found so many. I mean, we're just getting better at targeting stuff because we can develop predictive models, we can target different geological strata, and I think that really improves our picture. So let's go, you sent me that timeline, let me pull it back up. Let's think about this timeline of human evolution and how it's updated and what we can say. So you've mentioned, for example, that the last common ancestor, the LCA at the bottom, that should now be pushed further back.
Well, that's my view, because it's still up for debate.
Yeah.
There will people who say that it's younger. Some people say this idea of a single last common ancestor is even illusory, because by the time you've talked about the braided stream, I think that's probably maybe a simplification of the story. The braided stream, for me, if there is a braided stream, it's a braided stream from Africa. So Africa is still the main source of our genetic variation today, our morphology today. So in DNA terms, we're more than 90% recent African origin. And Svante Pääbo has that nice summary. I used to say, mainly out of Africa, and Svante said mostly out of Africa, and I think that's quite nice. So we're mostly out of Africa now. 20 years ago, I would have said we're virtually 100% recent African origin. Now, I'd say, we're more than 90% if you want a kind of quantification. So the braided stream, it's an interesting way of depicting it, but for me, these bars that I'm showing on this diagram, for me, they're separate lineages, and I would call most of them, as I've labeled them, separate species. And certainly it's debatable, but you can see they're in the center. There's the Neanderthal bars, which go up to about 40,000 years ago when it seems they physically disappeared. And then we've got what I've called basal Homo neanderthalensis, and that includes things like the material from the Cima del Huesos in Spain that I mentioned, the pit of the bones, that have given this ancient DNA that shows that they are early on the Neanderthal lineage. Then slightly to the left, you've got Homo sapiens, our present day Homo sapiens, I've called derived Homo sapiens. And then we've got what we call basal Homo sapiens. And these are the African fossils from 150, 200, 300,000 years ago, which I place early on our lineage and I would still call Homo sapiens. And the Denisovans, we move a bit to the right and you can see the Denisovan bar there. And as I say, we now know that goes back over 200,000 years in Denisova Cave. And then next to it, we've got this other bar, which I've labeled Homo daliensis or Homo longi.
Okay.
Now that's the Chinese. I used to call this material the China archaics because I didn't know what to call them, and they have lots of different people have called them, late Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens. There was this fossil from Dali in China, which was given the name originally Homo sapiens daliensis by Wu Jingji. And so maybe there was a species, you could call it Homo daliensis. I'd now redraw this diagram and say that we can be pretty confident now that group of Chinese fossils, most of them are Denisovans.
Okay.
So there's emerging data so we can more or less, where I've got a question mark and an equal sign, I would now get rid of that question mark and say Homo longi, which is the name given to the fossil from Harbin known as the Dragon Man fossil. So I was involved in studying that a few years back with Chinese colleagues. And this fossil's probably at least 150,000 years old from China, from northeast China. And, it's beautifully preserved. It's got one massive molar tooth in it, which obviously matches what we see at Denisova Cave. Yeah, you've got a picture of it brought up there. It's a wonderful fossil, mysterious. We could talk for quite a while about this fossil. It's got a very mysterious early history, how it was discovered. But it seems to be a distinct human. And now there's data from a number of Chinese fossils pointing to them being Denisovans. And I would say Harbin is the best preserved example now of a Denisovan.
Do we have DNA from any of those remains where we have clear fossil morphology, the shape and stuff?
Well, yeah, not yet. There's published data. So we should mention proteomics now, which is another technique. So of course, I've mentioned the DNA recovery, and
here, one
sometimes
second.
you get
just for everybody else. Proteomics is analyzing proteins that are left behind by various species, and they can be barcoded to specific species. So we use it a lot for zooarchaeology to study animals as well. Yeah. Yeah,
that's right. So it's a whole new way of looking at it. So of course the DNA preservation, as we've said, it dies out once you're past 100,000 years. It's really rare to get good DNA preservation. But fossil proteins survive better. They don't have as much information, but this is one of the great things for the future, is that we hope eventually to have fossil proteins from a number of these bars on this diagram. So wouldn't it be great to have fossil proteins from Homo naledi or Homo floresiensis? That is possible. I hope it will come soon. And some of the Chinese fossils have been done for their fossil proteins. Okay. So there's a jawbone from the Tibetan plateau of China, from Jiahe, Baishia Cave. And I don't know if we've got a picture of it there, maybe not. But jawbone from the Tibetan plateau of China, its proteomics suggest it's a Denisovan. Okay. And there is more unpublished work on Chinese fossils pointing to them being Denisovans as well. So I'm really quite confident. And the species name that was given to Dragon Man was Homo longi. And I regret that I didn't put my name on that paper. I couldn't. They did offer me to join them. And I was, at that stage, I was saying, well, there's probably Homo daliensis has priority. But more research suggested that name was never properly formally defined. So the daliensis name is probably invalid, and Homo longi, Dragon Man, becomes the species name for, if we want to give the Denisovans a species name, then it probably should be Homo longi. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I have another question for you for this, just because it's fresh in my brain, and this changes so rapidly. Not so rapidly, that's the wrong way to put it. It's just there's so many different perspectives on how to lump and split. And now that
Yeah,
we have DNA adding in, and sometimes that DNA matches to fossils or not, and so it gets complicated, is the point. What
yeah.
about Homo heidelbergensis? Where does that actually fit into this? Is that the ancestor of Neanderthals? Is that the ancestor of anatomically modern humans? Is it its own little branch? Like, what's up with them? There's something I've never quite gathered.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, it is complicated, and I've been changing my mind on this too. So you can see the bar for Heidelbergensis over on the left there, not to the far left where you got Naledi, but the next bar is labelled Heidelbergensis rhodesiensis, and it runs for about 300,000 years, about 600,000 down to around 300,000. So first of all, there's an issue over what we call all these different things because they're present in Europe and they're present in Africa and they're probably also in Asia too. So this jawbone from Germany was named the type of Homo heidelbergensis in 1908, a jawbone from, not surprisingly, near Heidelberg in Germany. And that was the type specimen of Homo heidelbergensis. And then in the 1980s, I was studying a number of skulls, crania, such as the one from Kabwe, at Broken Hill in Zambia, and Petrolona in Greece, Petrolona. And I found in my PhD work and later on that they were really quite similar to each other. So you had one in Greece and one in Zambia that seemed to be similar. And they unfortunately didn't have a jawbone. And then you've got the Mao jawbone, which is showing very nicely there, which doesn't have a skull.
Yeah.
So I, made the choice to say, well, probably that's the right name because the Heidelberg jawbone was then thought to be about 500,000 years old. And at that time, the Petrolona and Kabwe fossils were thought to be about 500,000 years old. So I made whether it was the right decision or not, to say, well, they're probably the same thing. So let's call them all Homo heidelbergensis. So that name then kind of took off and more people used it.
So this is all your fault.
Yeah, you can blame me for this wide use of heidelbergensis, really back to a paper I wrote in 1983. And so if you want to go back to the bar diagram again.
Yeah.
If we can get that back.
It should be up there, right?
Yeah, okay. So there are issues now. So first of all, there's the issue of whether I was correct, and other people who followed me have been correct in extending the name from that jawbone from Germany to all these other things. And that would not only include the Kabwe fossil, but Elandsfontein from South Africa, Bodo from Ethiopia, Arago from France, and so on. So, there's quite a few more you can add into this category. And some people think that, it's just a rag bag. It's a sort of dustbin category where you put things that are not, Neanderthal or Sapiens or Erectus, you throw them into Heidelbergensis. And that has become a tendency. Some people have just thrown everything in there.
Yeah.
I wrote a paper in 2012 on Heidelbergensis where I did much the same thing. I said, well, probably a lot of these things are going to be Heidelbergensis. But okay, now there's much more study of these things. And we can say that obviously the really fundamental issue is most of the wider view of Heidelbergensis is based on skulls that don't have jawbones. And then you've got this jawbone, which is the type specimen. So if only we had a skull to go with the Mauer mandible, and we don't. So some people think it's been used too widely, and we should just keep the name because the Mauer mandible has got some sort of idiosyncratic features. So some people think we should just keep the name for that jawbone, but then we need another name then for this wider group. And that's why I've got rhodesiensis on here, because that would be the next most likely name, because that name was given in 1921 to the Kabwe fossil. But of course, there are problems with using the rhodesiensis name. So some people, of course, say, well, it's named after, in there you've got the name of Cecil Rhodes, the great colonialist, and he did a lot of bad things, and we shouldn't be using a name that includes his name. And of course, it's there not because of him, but because it was found in what was then Northern Rhodesia, the British colony. So the name was given in 1921 after the geographical location it was found, and not honouring Rhodes. So I've tended to use that name, but I can see that some people really are offended by it. So there may have to be yet another rethink. Someone a group of people wrote a paper saying we should use the Bodo fossil and let's have Bodoensis as the species name. So all these debates are going on. But if we just put those naming debates to one side and just say, what can we say about that bar, that 300,000-year bar? And the fact is that I mentioned that back in the 1980s, we thought that Petralana and Cabway were about 500,000 years old, and the Mao mandible was about the same age. Well, the Mao mandible now is dated a bit older to about 600,000 years.
Okay.
And that matches the date for the Bodo fossil is also thought to be about 600,000.
Is this using new dating like uranium, thorium?
Yeah, so the Bodo one's been dated by argon dating from volcanic deposits. And the thing is that Petralana, I'm working on a paper on the dating of that at the moment, and it's pretty certainly younger than 500,000, but we're still working on that. But Cabway, obviously, that fossil is in the Natural History Museum, so I'm very familiar with it. And Rainer Grun and I have spent, most of our careers trying to get a date for that fossil, for that site. And the problem is it was found by miners, so in completely uncontrolled excavation. There are a lot of other material found at the site, but there's more or less nothing. I mean, the same day they found a shin bone about 1 meter away, so that could be associated. Lots of animal bones from the site, but who knows what belongs with the fossil. So Rainer and I and colleagues worked hard over many years, and eventually, by dating the fossil itself directly from uranium series dating and ESR dating on one of the tooth fragments, and looking at the surrounding materials as well, we came up with the best estimate of the fossil age at 300,000. So that's obviously much younger. So that's why that bar extends to 300,000.
Aha, okay.
And I think that's a reasonable age for the fossil. Of course, this diagram only shows you what I would consider the known dates. And of course, each of these bars is going to have, an extension in time up and down. So we have to remember that there's going to be some Heidelbergensis probably older than 600,000, and there are going to be some younger too.
Yeah.
So your students, when they look at this diagram, there'll be plenty of debate about how far you should extend these bars up and down in time. And I've made some connections here, which again are, some people might agree with them, some might not. So for Floresiensis, of course, we now know that the most complete skeleton of Homo floresiensis from Liang Bua on the island of Flores, that's probably around 60,000 years old now. But there are fossils in the cave and archaeology in the cave that takes the occupation back towards 200,000 years. But then down at 700,000 years, you've got some fossils found in a separate site in the Soa Basin away from the cave. And those fossils, they're more fragmentary, but they show a very similar morphology at 700,000 years.
Okay.
And there's also archaeology on Flores at more than 1 million. So it's likely that lineage goes back a long way on that island.
Very interesting.
And I've connected them up with a tentative dotted line, but quite likely. I mean, some people think that material at 700,000, it's so similar, let's call it Homo floresiensis. So that could be a continuity there of that lineage. And it must go back deeper in time. Of course, it has an ancestry somewhere else off Flores. Those people, if we call them people, they arrived there, maybe 1 million years ago or more, but in turn, they came from somewhere else before that, maybe from Java, maybe from Sulawesi. So there will be even older fossils somewhere of that lineage.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's changing so much. So you wanted to talk about Neanderthals, and one of the things that I remember was at some point those Neanderthals in Cima Los Huesos were thought to be Heidelbergensis, right? And now they're Neanderthals again?
Yeah, so I never used the Heidelbergensis name for them. I always said that was wrong because the dentitions of those, I mean, it depended on your view of Heidelbergensis. So some people I saw Heidelbergensis as being a common ancestor. If you look at my paper in 2012, I'm arguing that that's the common ancestor 500,000 years ago for us and Neanderthals. So there was a split, and in Africa we became Homo sapiens. In Europe and Asia we became Neanderthals. So it was a common ancestor. But with the redating of Heidelbergensis, that some of the fossils are much younger and actually even overlap with Homo sapiens and Neanderthal fossils, but also morphologically, Heidelbergensis, more studies show that the Heidelbergensis fossils have got their own derived features that take them away from what we would expect in a common ancestor.
Okay.
So they seem to be a separate branch, maybe an earlier branch off, and therefore not the common ancestor, which is why there is this question mark now about where is the last common ancestor, who was it, and when did the ancestor live? And we really don't know. So again, I would have said in 2012, the common ancestor pretty certainly lived in Africa, maybe 500,000 years ago. Now, I'm really not sure at all. It could have been 1,000,000 years ago. Maybe the ancestor was in Africa, but equally possible the ancestor was actually outside of Africa. And then you'd have to have an into Africa event, maybe 1,000,000 years ago, that began the sapiens evolution, separate evolution in Africa. So that again is another big rethink that I'm undergoing. And the Chinese fossils are an important part of that, because we're also studying fossils from China, which are older and which seem to take the Dragoman lineage back deeper in time.
Interesting.
And of course, if the Dragoman lineage goes back deeper in time, then so automatically will the Sapiens and Neanderthal lineages go back deeper in time if they are already separate. So, yeah, so that Chinese material is important for the development of this story. So I'm not any longer sure whether, the common ancestor would have lived in Africa. It's, for me, it's work in progress. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. And I think just to put the PowerPoint or the slide back up, I think this is so important for people to recognize this deep time perspective is part of the value of archaeology, to give us a different way of conceptualizing time, because we're so used to thinking about it in our own lives and within just a few generations. And here we're talking about hundreds of thousands to millions of years. And it's just such a different kind of perspective that we need to have. I mean, sometimes we get lucky and we find, Neanderthal, anatomically Homo sapiens hybrid, let's say, where it just happened within a few generations earlier, and we get that interesting snapshot. But so often trying to conceptualize what's going on in these long depths of time, and I always tell students, I get this from my dad, that we like to look around and look at our technology, and we're so superior and everything, and it's just like, we have not survived nearly as long as anatomically modern humans as many of our cousins and other ancestral groups. They were very resilient and lasted for hundreds of thousands of years longer. If we destroy this planet, we're going to prove that we are not very evolutionarily fit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So just to pick up on a couple of points that I mentioned along the way. So that basal Homo neanderthalensis there near the center of the diagram, around 400,000. So that's based partly on that material from the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones in Atapuerca. And as you say, that was called heidelbergensis by some people originally, but because of, the teeth in particular are very Neanderthal, even at 400,000 years. So that lineage was already established by that time. And so heidelbergensis for me never had those kinds of Neanderthal features, because I saw it as the common ancestor. So it predated the development then of those Neanderthal or Sapiens features. That's what you'd expect, of course, in a common ancestor. It's got to predate the evolution of those special features of its descendants. So that was part of my argument. So I always thought probably basal Neanderthals was what the Cima stuff was, rather than heidelbergensis. An antecessor, we haven't mentioned that yet, pioneer man. So this material is still only known from one site in Atapuerca, in the hills of Atapuerca. There's a deep chasm, really. So a Spanish British company, mining company, I think over 100 years ago, blasted a sort of ravine through the hills of Atapuerca to build a railway. They put a railway cutting through the hills, and they didn't know what they had done at the time, how important it would be. But that ravine, of course, is packed with sediment from ancient caves that they blasted through unknowingly. And so one of them, Grandolina, has produced these Homo antecessor fossils dated at around 850,000 years. And Spanish workers have argued that that could be the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens at about 850,000 years. And that is certainly a possibility. Unfortunately, we don't have other sites with antecessor identified. Of course, it can't just have lived in one site in Atapuerca. It must have been more widespread. We've got footprints in Britain, interestingly, at Haysborough in Norfolk, which are about 900,000 years old. So obviously we haven't got, because they're only footprints, they're not on the diagram, but those could indeed be footprints of Homo antecessor. Of course,
Okay.
we've only got stone tools from the site and these footprints of adults and children strolling by, walking by what was probably the River Thames up in Norfolk at that time. That could be Homo antecessor in Britain even, and they, chronologically matches up pretty well. But we can't, until we get the fossils from those British sites, we won't know. But antecessor, it could be close to the common ancestor. But interestingly, the work I've done with Chinese colleagues on the Chinese fossils suggests that antecessor could actually relate to the Longi Denisovan group.
Huh.
So that would be quite a turn if that Spanish material actually relates to material in China.
And this is why, when you think about that deep time perspective, hundreds of thousands of years, of course, all these different species could have been in places where we don't have a current fossil from due to preservation, or just simply access to sedimentary or soil layers from that period in time, which is, of course, why there's so many discoveries near the Great Rift Valley, because those sediments and soils are exposed and available to search. One question we got from an archaeologist, zooarchaeologist, Nathaniel Fossane, is I keep hearing people try to claim that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis are just subspecies of Homo sapiens. But if they don't both descend from Homo heidelbergensis, then that can't be the case. Is that your understanding as well then?
Yeah, so the whole question of species status is an ongoing debate. So if our work on the Chinese fossils is correct, you've got three deep separate lineages in the late Pleistocene. I'm leaving aside, Naledi and Flores now, but just talking about the three main ones that we know of. There's a Homo sapiens lineage that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Mm-hmm. There's a Neanderthal lineage that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And then there's the Homo longi denisovan lineage, which also goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And they're already separate, probably over 500,000 years ago. That would be the implication of our work. And so, yes, I regard them as different species, but of course there is the interbreeding. And some people say, well, if they're interbreeding, they're not different species. And yeah, at school, I was, the concept of species I was taught in my biology class a very long time ago was that species don't interbreed with each other. That's the definition.
We just talked about this today in class, exactly.
Yeah, the biological species definition. And that is just one of, I think someone counted there were at least 35 different species definitions. And of course, these species definitions, we create, nature doesn't argue what a species is. We make these species labels because we like labeling things. Nature doesn't play along with those neat categories. And in mammals and birds, sometimes it takes millions of years for these species to become distinct enough that they don't interbreed anymore. Mm-hmm. So these baboon species in Africa are examples of that. They've been diverging for hundreds of thousands of years, but they can still interbreed a bit. And we in Neanderthals were obviously in that situation too. So when we look at Neanderthals and us, I think that morphologically, and I used to work in a paleontology department, then it's kind of been dissolved into a science. We've now just got a science department, but I still am surrounded by paleontologists, and using the criteria they use to identify different fossil fish or fossil mammals, the Neanderthals and us clearly are different enough to be distinct species. Because if we look at even the ear bones, so in the middle ear, we've got these three tiny little bones that, transmit the sound for our hearing. And the shape of those bones is laid down in the embryo, and they are the first things that ossify in the whole skeleton. Their shape is fixed. When a baby is born, the shape of those ear bones is already fixed. And when you look at the shape of those ear bones with CT scanning, so you can do it obviously with, sometimes you actually physically have these ear bones fall out of a fossil, but otherwise with the CT scanner, you can look at them inside the fossil. And we can say that they're differently shaped in different kinds of primates. So we and chimpanzees, for example, have clearly different shapes for our bones, our middle ear bones, those three little ossicles. Okay. And when you compare us and Neanderthals, the shape differences are actually, in some ways, even greater than between the shape differences of us and chimpanzees. Huh. So that's three little tiny bones that are shaped before birth. They must be, you've got that diagram, that's great. They must be under strong genetic control. And you can see here that the difference between us and Neanderthals is at the level of differences between chimps and gorillas. And there are Homo sapiens fossils in there, and they all fall within the Homo sapiens group, and there are different Neanderthals that fall within the Neanderthal group. So for me, that's just one example. We can look at the pelvis and find the same level of differences between the groups. Neanderthals have a number of distinctive features in their skull. They've got this great big projecting middle of the face and nose, which is one of their most striking features. I mean, a lot of us have got big noses today, or high noses, or broad noses, but the Neanderthals had all three. And that's a kind of unique combination that really marks them out. And interestingly, the semen material only shows the start of that process. So although the teeth are very Neanderthal, the face is not anywhere near as developed as the late Neanderthals in that feature.
And we think the difference in the noses is largely due to adaptation to the colder environment?
Yeah, there are different arguments about that. So one view was cold conditions and breathing in very cold air. But when you look at populations today that live in really cold conditions, they don't have, I mean, they have very tall, narrow noses, which is not at all what the Neanderthals have got, very broad noses and very projecting noses. So it's possible they just had a different physiology, that nose shape was important for the cold. But equally, it could be linked with just very high respiratory demands. We know the Neanderthals were very active, they're very muscular, they're having to be active a lot of the day physically. They're working very hard, and they've got lungs that their ribcage suggests their lungs could have been 20% bigger than ours. So they needed to breathe in a lot of oxygen. And that nose is then a mechanism to, breathe in and out and a lot of air, which they were having to do. Of course, it could be being warmed up and humidified as well. That would be a nice extra feature. But that's another thing we have to remember about the Neanderthals, that we tend to think of them in the last ice age of Europe, but they've got an evolutionary history, as we've said, of hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
And that takes them through warm conditions as well as cold conditions. So yes, we find them in Britain or Germany or France 50,000 years ago, nearby mammoths and woolly rhinos and reindeer. But if we go back 250,000 years, we find them in Italy alongside hippopotamuses and elephants. So they weren't just cold adaptive beings. They actually had a wider range. So their physiology had to adapt not just to the cold conditions, but to warm conditions as well.
Yeah.
And their body shape is short and wide. And that, of course, is also linked probably with overall colder conditions. But they would have varied through time. And that nose, I think we don't know for sure. I mean, there's even the view that it could just be there for non-functional reasons, that they just thought big noses were very sexy. And so,
somebody in the chat just suggested that even.
Yeah, they just thought they were attractive, big noses, and so they got selected for. And that brings us on to the brow ridge. We didn't talk about that yet, but that's another remarkable feature of all of these ancient humans. Of course, we've got this big bar of bone over the eyes, and I don't think we've got a good explanation really for why that bar of bone is there and why we don't have it. And of course, people used to think that it was there as a protection, it from blows from above, or also it sort of absorbed the stresses and strains of chewing, chomping heavy bones and stuff. And so these brow ridges were there to spread the stress and strain. But of course, when you CT scan these brow ridges in many fossils, and particularly in the heidelbergensis fossils like Cabway and Petralina, the brow ridge is virtually hollow. It's huge, but it's hollow, virtually hollow. It's got a huge air sinus across it, and the bone is wafer thin. So it seems to have no functional significance from that point of view. And so you come up with alternative explanations, like there was a guy called Grover Krantz, an anthropologist, American anthropologist. He was a believer in Bigfoot, and quite an eccentric guy, but good fun certainly to meet and talk to. But Grover was puzzled by the brow ridge too, so he was all into actually doing experiments. So he replicated the brow ridge off a Homo erectus fossil, the biggest one from Olduvai hominid 9, and he strapped it on and he wore it day and night for 6 months to see what it would do for him.
Okay. What did it do?
One thing he found was that on a very sunny day, it acted as a great sun visor, so he could see further. So he could envisage erectus out on the African plains, being able to see where the next meal was, or where the nearest threat was, or where the nearest people were. That was a possibility.
It's like the hat,
Well, there you go. And the paper is actually entitled that he wrote about this called Cranial Hair and Brow Ridges. So he came up with what I think was not his finest hour. He decided that what it also did for him, because he had long hair, this is the 1970s, and so when he ran along, when he had the brow ridge, he found that his hair parted nicely behind him, and he could see where he was going when he was running fast. Now, the problem with this is that, you know, these are people who are using sharp stone tools every day to cut up animals.
They could cut their hair. Yeah.
And why couldn't they work out, oh, my hair's in the way, let me cut it? So I don't think that was just, but what he also found, and this is where I think he was probably closer to the truth, is that on a dark night, people coming around a corner and running into Grover with these huge brow ridges were shocked and scared to death. And so it's possible, and there have been papers written about this now, that it was some kind of signaling device between humans at that time. And it would have been for a couple of million years. These people were using an aggressive stare to, you know, and in gorillas, of course, they beat their chests, so they bare their big canines. We haven't got big canines. Okay, we can beat our chests a bit, but this was an aggressive stare. Keep away from my food, keep away from my partner. And this was one of their social signals. And so this brow ridge actually got selected up to a certain point anyway to be big. So it's an external display, not for functional reasons, but it's there as an external display, a bit like the antlers of deer. Yeah, which are also used for display. So that's a possibility, in which case, why don't we have the brow ridge? Well, first of all, we've got a high forehead. So the whole conformation of this area is different, but also we've got eyebrows, which are used for signaling. And so we may have switched to eyebrow signaling as more important. And also we've got all these other ways of displaying to each other. So we've got bling, and we've got tattoos and piercings and of course weaponry to show off to each other. So possibly we've moved on from that, you know, signaling mechanism. So this is all speculation because we don't really know, but it's an interesting idea, and it's more convincing than the functional interpretations, I think.
I think that makes sense. And I mean, we see that in other aspects of human evolution with less sexual dimorphism and things like that, where signaling has become more behavioral and extrasomatic, if you will, meaning beyond just our bodies. And so, yeah. So wait, you wanted to talk, though. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I mean, we can stay and chat as long as you want. But you wanted to talk to me about the extinction of Neanderthals as well, right?
Yeah, sure. Of course, it's a big topic, and a lot of people ask about that. Why aren't they here? You know, and it's a pretty good question. And of course, in a sense, they are still here because, as we've said, you know, you and I have got maybe around 2% Neanderthal DNA, and people have totaled up. So if we go back 50,000 years when there were, you know, at best tens of thousands of Neanderthals, total up how much DNA they've got. Come to today, billions of people have got Neanderthal DNA, and it may only be at the level of 2%. But if you total up those billions of people, there's actually far more Neanderthal DNA around today than there ever was in the past. So I say they've become physically extinct, but they live on genetically in us, and so do Denisovans, of course. So physically extinct, the evidence seems to point to them disappearing where we've got the best data around 40,000 years ago. In Europe, it's difficult. There are some people who still argue for it, but where you've got the best dates, it seems that Neanderthal fossils have gone by 40,000 years, and their associated stone tool industries are also gone by 40,000 years. Now that's Europe, of course. Who knows? You know, they were at times in Uzbekistan, they were in Siberia, maybe they were in India. So we can't say where they died out across the rest of their range going further east, because they did stretch a long way eastwards as well. But at least where we've got the best data, they seem to be gone by 40,000 years ago. And the evidence is, of course, as we've mentioned already, for this interbreeding. And I think that is important in the story, because what's interesting is that, in that, let's say that last 10,000 years, 40 to 50,000, all of the Homo sapiens fossils we've got where we have genomes show that they've got Neanderthal DNA, but none of the Neanderthal fossils from that period have Homo sapiens DNA coming in at that time. So that's interesting. And we don't know why. It could just be sample size, and maybe if we get more late Neanderthal genomes, we'll start to find evidence. But at the moment, it isn't there. And so I argued with my colleague Lucille Crett a couple of years ago that this could be part of the explanation for the extinction. I'm not the first person to suggest it, but in a sense, we absorbed some of the last Neanderthals, but we did it in a one-way process that disadvantaged the Neanderthals because they were losing prime age individuals to the other species, and they weren't getting anything back. And we don't know if there was exchange of partners into Neanderthals, but there was some hybrid barrier. And that can happen sometimes when you have hybrid pairings of different species. The hybrids may do better in one group than in the other. So, for example, we know that the Neanderthal pelvis was a different shape than our own. And we know that head shape, even in babies, is different between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So possibly Homo sapiens mother giving birth to a hybrid in her own group was relatively okay. But maybe a Neanderthal mother giving birth to a hybrid in a Neanderthal group, her shape of her pelvis, something, was incompatible, and the babies just weren't viable. So possibly the hybrids survived better in a sapiens environment than they did in a Neanderthal environment. Or maybe, and I'm thinking now of Ludovic Slimak's book.
So I have a question for you really quickly.
Yeah.
With that last idea, wouldn't mitochondrial DNA be able to start answering that? Because, or Y chromosome DNA to try to see if only one...
Yeah, I mean, obviously people are looking at that in all as widely as possible. And at the moment, there's no evidence of it going into Neanderthals.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, in the long term, what will be interesting to know is how the interbreeding actually happened. What was it mainly friendly? Was it mainly sapiens guys grabbing Neanderthal women and taking in their group? Was it adopting orphan babies? All of those are possible scenarios, and maybe all of them did happen. But interestingly, that one-way process meant that Neanderthals, who by then were low in numbers, and low in genetic variability in the last 10,000 years, to be losing prime age individuals to the other species, who is then competing economically, of course, because those sapiens groups, as they grew in number, I think they were growing at the expense of the contemporary Neanderthal groups, because they're going to want to hunt the same animals, they're going to want to collect the same plant resources, they're going to want to live in the best areas and the best cave sites and so on. Mm-hmm. So there would have been an economic competition. I don't know how directly hostile it was. Maybe they coexisted in many cases successfully. But the net result was, as time went on, the Neanderthals lost people to the sapiens group, and they weren't replenishing their DNA. And that's obviously bad news. And we know that DNA, of course, as it came into us, was also useful, because we know we got immune systems from Neanderthals. So, of course, having evolved in Africa, we didn't have natural immunities to the local diseases where Neanderthals and Denisovans lived. So by interbreeding with them, we got a quick fix to our immune systems. So that was good news for us. Not such good news today when some of these bits of DNA are linked with autoimmune conditions. So some people, some people have too sensitive DNA, and some of that is down to Neanderthal DNA. So this interbreeding between species that we've talked about, in nature, what happens is obviously things go their separate way. They develop their own DNA, they lose some of their variability and develop other variability. But by now and again mixing back in with their close relatives, they can top up their genetic diversity. Yeah. Now, some of that will be not useful, but others will be useful. You can reacquire lost diversity, and you can also acquire some of the good things that the other lineages evolved.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the issues we see with agricultural crops and animals. We've limited those populations so much that they become susceptible to all kinds of disasters. So seeing biodiversity, not just as a diversity of species, which is really important within an ecological system, but also a diversity of genetic adaptations within a larger species or multiple species that can intermingle. That's really important, that we need to focus on in our world today, I think. It's really important.
I should just come back to one point. I was beginning to raise the point about Neanderthals, that some have suggested that Neanderthals may have also been a bit more insular. They were a bit less social generally with outsiders. And so maybe the Neanderthal groups didn't welcome interbreeding with Homo sapiens. I mean, that's also possible. There could have been a social barrier there that didn't go in the opposite direction, but did go affect Neanderthals acquiring sapiens DNA in that last phase.
Yeah, and I suppose if my dad was around, he'd probably be thinking, well, you could look at lithic technologies and you can see that Neanderthals were not as, they weren't as diverse in their lithic technologies that they used as anatomically modern humans, and that could be an indication of maybe their social behavior, let's say, towards
Yeah,
new
that's right.
ideas and new peoples and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, your dad worked obviously a lot on the shuttle Peronian, which is this
Hmm.
industry which until now is
Who made
thought to
it?
be, yeah, who made it? So for a long time, nobody knew. And then this Neanderthal fossil from Saint-Césaire was found in a Shadowbronian level. So then, Neanderthals made it. And some other sites seem to back that up. Now it's being rethought.
Hmm.
And some people are saying, well, actually, the Neanderthals didn't make the Shadowbronian either. And that also is an early Homo sapiens industry. So there is a lot of debate about that. Neanderthals may well have borrowed culturally from us in that period of coexistence, and we may well have borrowed from them too. So this is an very interesting area of archaeological study.
Yeah, and especially because most sites, let's be honest, have no real hominid remains. They have stone tools, they have
Yeah,
animal remains, they might have
yeah,
evidence of fire or other things like that, but they
yeah.
rarely have remains from hominids. And so,
And that's where the sediment DNA is going to be so important because a
yeah,
number of those sites could have DNA of either group. So it just needs one of those Neanderthals or early sapiens to have had a wee in one of those caves, and their DNA could be there in the sediment.
yeah. So, okay, so we have a few questions for you. Let's see if I can find one that fits. All right, this is a good question. What makes any given subject a sapiens with Neanderthal DNA as opposed to a Neanderthal with sapiens DNA?
Sorry, could you say that one again?
So, what makes a given, fossil find?
Yeah.
You mentioned that what we found is anatomically modern humans with Neanderthal DNA,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
as opposed to a Neanderthal with sapiens DNA. How do you divide that difference? Is it based on
Yeah, sure.
morphology or is it genetic
Okay, so with the
relatedness?
with the fossils, yeah. So with the fossils, of course, we can look at them and say how typical a Neanderthal is this, how typical a sapiens is it? And someone like Eric Trinkhaus saw kind of hybrids almost everywhere. He looked in the early sapiens, he thought all of them showed Neanderthal influences. And I would say he was mostly wrong about that. But with the Oase fossil from Romania, he was right because that fossil has some unusual features and some big teeth. It's got a nice chin on it. So we call it a Homo sapiens in overall shape. But the teeth are quite large and unusual. And when its DNA was sequenced, it's got close to 10% Neanderthal DNA in it.
Huh.
So Eric was right about that one. And so, yes, there are most of the fossils clearly fall into either being very, typical Neanderthal or typical sapiens. We
Yeah.
haven't really found, there must be some real hybrids somewhere, of course. If the interbreeding happened, there are going to be, as
There
there is
has
in
to be.
Denisova Cave, there's got to be some real hybrids, and it will be so exciting when we find one. I'm sure we will find one sooner or later, but at the moment they seem to fall, and it's the DNA which is showing us. So when you look at those Neanderthal fossils and get their genomes, and we've got dozens now of those Neanderthal genomes, we don't find in the later ones there's any sign of sapiens DNA coming in, but in the sapiens ones, as I mentioned, all of them have Neanderthal DNA in them. And in some cases, I mentioned Oase, it's really high at 10%. That shows that it's come in very recently in the previous few generations. In most of them, it's already heading down to the levels we find today. So it might be 3 or 4%. But within a few generations, within a couple of thousand years, that Neanderthal DNA had gone down close to the levels we find today. So by 40,000 years, it was already down at much lower levels. It was obviously there. Some people estimate it was there at around 10% in the interbreeding phase.
Okay, that
And the
makes a lot of
evidence is
sense.
that, yeah, there was one main interbreeding phase, which is the one that is found. So geneticists reckon that the DNA in Neanderthals that we have today has come essentially from one phase of interbreeding, maybe
Okay.
45,000 years ago. And the inference is that it was probably somewhere in Western Asia. What we see then is some extra DNA added on in Europe. So there's then subsidiary extra bits of interbreeding that we pick up in later generations, maybe thousands of years later. But interestingly, pretty well all of those pre-40,000 sapiens populations essentially died out. The Aurignacians are the only ones who kind of went on, but the ones we find at Bachakiro, some of those have survived on, but most of their DNA has gone. The Oase individual has no later descendants. The Zlati Kun individual has no later descendants. The Ust Ishim individual has no later descendants. So those early sapiens groups were pioneers, and a lot of them just died out. And their Neanderthal DNA that they had acquired died out with them.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what makes this so complicated. Exactly. There's so many evolutionary dead ends at the same
Yeah,
time as all these minglings. And
yeah,
so it's
yeah.
just like it becomes extremely complex. Yeah, man.
Yeah. And
That I
sapiens was
hadn't
prone
even
to
thought about
extinctions.
the dead ends even more recently. We talk about how we all have some Neanderthal DNA, and yeah, of
Yeah,
course there's going to be
yeah,
dead ends.
yeah.
Yeah.
And these replacement events didn't stop when we get to Homo sapiens, as you said. The replacements kept going on, and we've got these turnovers in Europe, even in sapiens groups,
Hmm.
pretty well complete genetic turnovers that even go on, of course, into the last 10,000 years.
One second. I got a super chat, and my Indiana Jones hat is right here. I'm just not wearing it so I can have my headphones on while I chat. Um, what else? So we have some good questions about. Okay, in a sense, let's try to summarize a few different questions here. One of the ideas is, can we estimate the different size of populations? So maybe humans anatomically modern humans sort of swamped out that Neanderthal signature. But on another related note, people are asking about sort of DNA that is dominant or recessive or adaptive. Is that the case, that we have more adaptive Neanderthal DNA and that's why it stayed steady at 2%, 4%? I guess let's try to summarize all those questions in one go.
Yeah, so on that
Yeah,
DNA question, obviously you need a geneticist to answer it properly. So
yeah.
I can only give an approximate answer from listening to geneticists talking about it. But the fact is that most of the Neanderthal DNA in our genomes today is not doing much at all. It's just there and not affecting us. There are a few things where it is affecting us for better or worse. And so, for example, with the COVID epidemic, there were some bits of Neanderthal DNA that made people in some countries more liable to get COVID and even die from it.
Hmm.
And in other countries, bits of Neanderthal DNA that gave resistance. And I heard Svante Parbo giving a talk not long ago where he discussed some of this. And in Europe, the COVID DNA that was causing the problems, the Neanderthal DNA that was causing the problems and causing extra mortality in COVID patients, they got it more seriously. You think, well, that's bad news. But in fact, what was interesting is the same bits of DNA had already been shown to give some resistance to HIV.
Okay.
So interesting, it swings and roundabouts. So that
Yeah.
DNA had built up in frequency during the HIV epidemic, but then when COVID hit, it was bad news to have it. So this is what goes on all the time. So, the bits of DNA are going to help you in some way. So it's thought that tuberculosis, for example, and plagues, these would have affected the presence or absence. Some of that Neanderthal DNA might have been good news to have, and some of it was bad news to have. And so, it's being affected through time. And we know that, as we've said, that some of that bits of Neanderthal DNA are linked with autoimmune conditions we have today, like Crohn's disease and biliary
Yeah.
cirrhosis and so on. And thromboses too. That's another weird thing, that if you've got some bits of Neanderthal DNA, you may be more likely to suffer thromboses and even die from it. And the story there seems to be that 40 or 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals had a factor which actually slowed down. It actually sped up healing. So, of course, in the Paleolithic world, it was dangerous to get cut. You're going to cut yourself while you're making flint tools. You're going to encounter dangerous animals that will make you bleed. Women giving birth without a lot of support. So having a factor that sped up the congealing of blood was good news 40 or 50,000 years ago. We picked that up into breeding, and it was good news for us 40 or 50,000 years ago. But now, someone my age who goes and sits on a plane for 7 hours, it's not such good news to have that factor, because I'm going to be much more likely to have a stroke.
And this is something that I hope everybody recognizes, is adaptive features are only adaptive in certain types of situations and contexts and environments. So something that's adaptive in one context is actually bad in another context, and that's the messiness of adaptation in a
Yeah,
sense,
that's right.
and
Yeah,
natural
yeah.
selection. Yeah. Let's see. Do we have? I think we've hit most of the key questions we've gotten. I mean, there's a few other different ones here. Everybody, just remember, we're doing Real Archaeology all weekend. Check out www.real-archaeology.com. And if you have another 5-10 minutes, I'd love to talk with you about public engagement. If you don't, I will say goodbye to you, and we'll chat again. We're hoping to do a video together at some point in the future on Out of Africa, just so everybody knows. So we're not going to
Yeah.
deal with questions on that kind of topic right now. So do you want to talk about your approach to public engagement? You're one of the best scholars at doing that in this field. You're very active at it. So what's your thoughts on that as a topic and how we can approach it
Yeah,
better?
sure. So yeah, working obviously in a big public museum. Yeah, I obviously have a lot of letters from the public. It used to be letters, now because it's emails and tweets and so on. But I've got stacks of correspondence, of course, over the years from people asking about human evolution. I've tried to promote the displays in our museum on human evolution, and we've got a display now that, well, it's getting on for 10 years old now, so you can imagine it's already out of date in some areas. So there are many different competing resources needed at the museum, and exhibitions is one of them. But I certainly hope that we can keep our human evolution exhibition updated. I think you've got the cover of my book, Our Human Story, which I've written with my colleague Louise Humphrey. So that's a museum publication, that book, Our Human Story. That's certainly another bit of my outreach. And I've written a book with Rob Dinnis called Written 1 Million Years of the Human Story. So those are two popular books which you can find from the museum. So yeah, they're worth looking at. I've written other books too. So yes, and articles, interviews, podcasts like the one I'm doing now. I try to, I don't believe that we should be keeping our ideas to ourselves. I think putting them out there for discussion is always good. And sometimes you can get really challenging and interesting comments from a non-expert, can sometimes give you a completely different perspective on looking at a problem you're looking at.
Yeah.
I mean, that question of brow ridges, it's an interesting one. How we began to walk upright, that is one of the fundamental questions in human evolution. What
100%.
drove the origin of bipedalism? And again, no one has come up with, for me at least, with a really convincing explanation. And so anyone out there can start to think about this and come up with ideas on it, which could be useful.
Yeah, there are not many examples of organisms going from quadrupedal to bipedal.
Yeah,
And so it
that's
is
right.
kind of very interesting what it's done for us as a species and our related species.
Yeah.
And it's just
I mean, it's obviously fundamental, but okay, there's the aquatic ape theory. There's the view that it began up in the trees. Actually, that seems sort of counterintuitive, but orangs and gibbons, of course, when they're up in the trees, they use their long arms to walk along branches, and while they're doing that, their body is essentially walking upright. So one view is it began up in the trees.
That makes sense. One of the things I wanted to do is go back in time and talk to J.R.R. Tolkien, because he writes about these elves that live in the trees, and it's like, why don't they have, prehensile feet and things like that? They should be adapted to that arboreal environment if they're tree-living elves.
Yes, absolutely. Well, maybe they moved there recently and haven't had time. Who knows?
Yeah.
They've been driven up there,
And now everybody's joking, and advanced civilization taught us to walk upright, obviously.
Of course, absolutely. It was aliens that did it.
It was all aliens.
Yeah.
And the Denisovans were actually the Atlantis population, right?
Yeah. Well, don't joke about it.
Somebody's going to clip me out of here, and now it's going to be the new thing. That's the danger of the world. You say stuff, and you could be sarcastic or not. And
that's right. But it shouldn't stop us doing outreach. I think what you're doing is a great job too. And I think that, I'm obviously paid directly or indirectly by the British taxpayer, working at the Natural History Museum. And so, I owe it to get my ideas out there. And I've tried to do that right through my career. And it's been good for me too, because learning to communicate to everybody, not just the specialists, is a really important lesson to learn.
100%. And I think it also makes us better as scholars. You really understand something when you can communicate it in an understandable fashion. And one of the things I find that some of our colleagues sometimes struggle with, and maybe this chat shows a different way forward, which is that we're so used to engaging with children and we simplify things. But when we talk to adults, they want to understand the details and the nuance and the complexities. We just have to make sure that we express it in an understandable way. And so that's what I find people are interested in, is those details and the fundamental evidence we use. And
that's right. And the jargon we throw in all the time as specialists. So you picked up on proteomics straight away, that explaining what that is, because it's easy for us to just throw these terms in there and think, well, actually that wasn't introduced. That's a new term. I need to say what it is for people who don't know. Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, somebody, I mean, he was an archaeologist, I forget where it was in the chat, asked if we can actually get proteins from any Neanderthal skeletons. Is there enough collagen preserved to be able to get that? The collagen is the soft tissue of the bone, in a
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
certainly. Yeah, yeah. It's there. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I think this was really, really useful. I noticed that some of my students from class were in. That reminds me. One of my students wanted to ask you. I'm not sure if she's in the live chat or not, but
Uh-huh.
the question was: do you enjoy working, or do you work with the radical anthropology group at UCL at all?
Well, I talk to them once a year.
Okay.
It's a long tradition that goes back a long way because I know them personally. So yes, I do talk there. Yeah, and I'm giving a talk there in a couple of weeks' time. Yeah,
Oh, perfect. All right. Well, then people should go
yeah.
see you there. And online, Chris is constantly doing outreach on his Twitter. Is there anywhere else? What's your Twitter handle again? Let me put that in the live chat.
It's yeah, at Chris Stringer 65.
Chris Stringer 65. That's one of your
Yeah.
key outreach platforms. Do you have any others that I'm
Yeah, I mean,
missing?
obviously, a lot of debate about Twitter, and I know that many of my colleagues have left Twitter now, and I think about it regularly whether I want to stay there. I go on to somewhere like Blue Sky. Where are you mainly
To be
on
honest,
those
I'm
media?
trying to move more here for various reasons. What I've
Yeah,
found since Twitter sort of had its downfall is that everything is so divided. And what
yeah,
that means is you have to post the same thing in like 4 different spaces, and it's really difficult. And so
yeah,
I've been trying to make YouTube my main platform for a number of different reasons. One is we can have these kind of conversations, right? And then
yeah,
we have
yeah,
people having chats right now and asking questions, and it's really engaging and it's
yeah,
visual. I can pull up stuff, and
yeah.
it also then survives. This chat will be available for people to see, next
Yes,
week or in a year and
yeah,
whatnot. And
yeah,
so
yeah,
I
yeah,
find YouTube is probably one of our best resources as archaeologists and scholars, where we can
yes.
put a human face on it. It can be visual, it can be audio, it can really do it all. And so that's where I'm trying to move. But I'm still on Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on
Yeah,
Threads. I'm on
yeah.
yeah, it's just like
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I've got 30,000 followers on Twitter, and I kind of feel that I owe it to them to stay there and carry on communicating, and I still get useful stuff from it, but less useful than it used to be. That's for sure.
yeah, yeah. And I mean,
More divisive, more abuse, more trolling.
more
Absolutely.
abuse, more trolling. We have less
Yeah,
reach. I think it was Becky
yeah,
Rag Sykes. She pulled out my post on Blue Sky advertising this event, Real Archaeology. I made the
yeah,
exact same post on Blue
yeah,
Sky where I have almost 4,000, maybe something 3,000 or 4,000 followers, and on
yeah,
Twitter where I have 40,000. And
yeah,
the engagement on Twitter was only twice that of Blue Sky. And so,
yeah, yeah,
what I've
yeah,
realized is I don't have the same reach I used to, partly because a lot of my people
yeah,
left, partly
yeah,
because now I have all these trolls that I block, and I have to, therefore, the algorithm doesn't like me because I block people. But I'm not going
yeah.
to take that abuse. I'm here to provide educational content,
Sure.
not to be a platform for people to troll. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
sorry, I'm not
yeah.
here to debate, guys. I'm here to have conversations with colleagues, and
Yes,
like,
yes,
and make
yes.
this available for people. And so that's like
Yeah,
our goal.
yeah,
Oh, we do have one last question that I think is interesting, just because it's something that I think is good. So you mentioned
yeah,
that Neanderthals, we now think they potentially the morphology of them went extinct around 40,000 years ago, but that's well
yeah,
before the last glacial maximum, and before
yeah,
those refugia would have been refugia. And
yeah.
so, how do we now understand this change in chronology with this change? Our understanding is now different on that. What's your thoughts on that?
So that's the change in Neanderthal morphology through time. Are we talking about? I'm not quite sure what the
Or
question is
just
getting at.
I guess the question is I'm sort of paraphrasing as well. Well, if they're not going extinct at the last glacial maximum, then we
Yeah.
no longer think that they're fleeing to refugia that are isolated. Instead, it's for a different reason that they went
Well, they
extinct.
were doing that, of course. Yeah. So,
Okay.
of course, the glacial maximum at 20,000 or so was very severe, and Homo sapiens certainly was going into refugia. If Neanderthals had still been around, they would have had to do it. But they had done it, of course, many times before, because there was a similarly severe glacial maximum maybe 140,000 years ago, and over 200 and over 300 and 400,000. So these changes were constantly happening. And even in the last 100,000 years, as you know, these very short-term millennial scale oscillations were causing very short, sharp shocks to the European climate system. So it might be almost as warm as the present day for maybe 500 years. And then very suddenly it would go to as freezing cold as at the glacial maximum. But the ice caps, of course, in a short time can't grow. So, and then within 1,000 years, it switches back again. And this kept happening. And I think that's why the Neanderthals in their last 50,000 years could never build a large population. So they were pushed back into refugia, and then they'd bounce back. And then 1,000 years later, all those people in the new areas die out. And again, they're dependent on who's left in the refugia. So they were suffering that. And it really kept their numbers down. The Denisovans range much more widely. We know they were in Siberia. They must have been down in the subtropics in Southeast Asia. So they range much more widely, and they probably had larger numbers and more diversity. The Neanderthals in their last stages were, thin on the ground. Literally, there were thousands of them, and they were low in genetic diversity as far as we know, which was bad news for them as a species.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it also reminds me. I study climate change in a much later periods, like the ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the Mediterranean. And one of the things we're starting to realize is how stable the climate has an impact on society. And so when there's lots of changes that are rapid, that has very negative impacts on the ability to produce food or get food.
Right.
And so it really then, I think, both of these examples, Neanderthals and humans from a few thousand years ago, they show the challenges we face now with rapid climate change happening. And yes, we have more technology and smarts and stuff like that, but we're going to have to get our act together so that we can actually survive longer as a species than the Neanderthals did, because they were damn resilient. Yeah. All right, then. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you'll boost some of our posts on social media throughout the weekend. To everybody else, go to www.real-archaeology.com. We have a whole range of stuff. I'm going to log off for about 45 minutes, and in 45 minutes I'll be joined by PhD student J.T. Lewis. We'll talk about some of the mound sites in North America, and we'll introduce the event as a whole as people are waking up in the U.S., because that's what's happening in the U.S., where the world we're trying to hit all these different time zones. It's tough. But yeah, thank you so much. It was a really good conversation.
I think talking to you, Flynn.
Yeah,
and we'll do it again soon.
We will do it again soon. It was really good. And
Right.
see you all later.